Did you know that a young Roman woman watched her father being branded like a criminal and sent into exile to die, then witnessed her mother and sister tortured and killed before her very eyes, yet never once renounced Christ or lost her joy? That when left completely alone and orphaned by persecution, she faced seduction with purity and torture with praise? How does someone so young carry such ancient courage? This is the story of Saint Bibiana, the joyful martyr who proved that Christian joy doesn't depend on circumstances, that watching your family die for Christ can strengthen rather than destroy faith, and that the young can possess heroic courage when grace sustains them. Rome in the year 361 was a city holding its breath. Julian the Apostate had seized the imperial throne, and the world that Christians had begun to trust was collapsing beneath their feet. This emperor, raised in the faith, baptized as a child, had turned his back on Christ and now sought to restore the old gods with a convert's zeal. Temples reopened, sacrifices resumed, and families who had lived openly as Christians for decades suddenly found themselves marked, watched, vulnerable. In one such household lived Flavian, a man who had once held high office as prefect, a position of honor and authority. His wife Dafrosa was known for her gentle wisdom and quiet charity. Their two daughters, Demetria and Bibiana, had been raised in the light of faith, taught to pray before they could read, to love Christ before they understood doctrine. Their home was modest, but filled with peace. Neighbors knew them as people who kept their word, shared their bread, and spoke of God without embarrassment or fear. Flavian had served Rome faithfully, but he served Christ first. When the new emperor's edicts began requiring sacrifice to the pagan gods, when officials were ordered to renounce Christianity or lose their positions, Flavian did not hesitate. He had known comfort, but he would not trade truth for it. Dafrosa stood beside him, her face serene even as the future darkened. Their daughters watched and learned what fidelity looked like when it cost everything. The family gathered each evening for prayer, their voices rising softly in the Psalms. They broke bread together and remembered the words of Christ. "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world." Little did young Bibiana know how soon those words would be tested. Little did she understand that the warmth of this household, the laughter of her sister, the steady voice of her father, the gentle hands of her mother, all of it was about to be torn away, leaving her alone with nothing but the faith they had planted deep in her heart. The storm was coming, but in that quiet home, they were ready. It began with a summons. Flavian was called before the governor Apronianus, a man whose loyalty to Julian was absolute and whose contempt for Christians was barely concealed. The charges were simple: refusal to sacrifice to the gods, promotion of a foreign superstition, disloyalty to the empire. Flavian stood calm before the court, his hands steady, his voice clear. When ordered to renounce Christ, he spoke only 5 words: "I am a servant of Christ." The sentence came swiftly. Stripped of his position, branded on the forehead like a criminal with a hot iron that seared the sign of his treachery into his flesh, then exiled from Rome. They took everything: his property, his dignity, his freedom. The branding was meant to humiliate, to mark him as an enemy of Rome for all to see. But Flavian bore it without flinching. The pain was temporary. The mark would fade, but his witness would endure. He was led out of the city in chains, sent to a distant place where cold and hunger and isolation would finish what the branding began. Dafrosa and her daughters stood at a distance, watching him go. They could not approach. Guards kept them back. But Bibiana saw her father turn once, just once, and his eyes found hers. He nodded. It was enough. He was saying goodbye, and he was saying, "Do not be afraid." Within weeks, word came that Flavian was dead. The exile had killed him. His body, already weakened by torture, could not survive the harsh conditions. He died alone, far from home, with only Christ to comfort him. When the news reached their house, Dafrosa did not scream or curse. She knelt and prayed. Demetria wept quietly, and Bibiana, the youngest, felt something crack inside her chest. Not her faith, but her childhood. She was no longer a girl. She was a Christian in a world that killed Christians, and her father's death was only the beginning. Now 3 women remained, a widow and 2 daughters, living in a house that felt suddenly too large and too quiet. The neighbors who once greeted them now looked away. Friends stopped visiting. They were marked now, not with brands like Flavian, but with something worse, fear. To associate with them was dangerous. To help them was to risk joining them. And so they lived in growing isolation, waiting to see what would come next. They did not wait long. Apronianus was not finished. Flavian's refusal had humiliated him, and the family's continued presence in Rome was an insult he would not tolerate. If the father would not bend, perhaps the mother and daughters would. He sent soldiers to their home at dawn, before the city was awake, before anyone could see or intervene. Dafrosa and Demetria were arrested. Bibiana, too young to be immediately charged, was forced to watch. They dragged her mother and sister to the public square, where a crowd gathered, some curious, some sympathetic, most simply afraid to leave. The governor gave them one chance: sacrifice to the gods or die. Dafrosa shook her head gently. "We worship Christ alone." Demetria, trembling but resolute, echoed her mother's words. "Christ is Lord." What followed was brutal. They were beaten, scourged, tortured in ways meant to break not just their bodies, but their spirits. The crowd murmured, some in pity, others in contempt. But Bibiana, held back by guards, could only watch. She saw her mother's face, bruised and bloodied, but somehow still at peace. She saw her sister's hands reach for their mother's, their fingers intertwining even as the blows fell. She heard their voices, weak but clear, praying the psalms they had sung together at home. And then, one by one, they died. Dafrosa first, her breath stopping mid-prayer. Then Demetria, younger, stronger, but unable to survive the torture. Their bodies crumpled to the ground, and the crowd dispersed. The show was over. 2 more Christians are dead. 2 more examples were made. Bibiana stood frozen, her mind unable to grasp what her eyes had seen. Father gone, mother gone, sister gone. In a matter of weeks, her entire family had been erased. She was 20 years old and utterly alone. The guards released her and walked away. What threat was one orphaned girl? She stumbled home through empty streets, the house that had been filled with voices now silent as a tomb. That night, she knelt in the darkness and wept, but even in her tears, something remained unbroken. Her family had not died regretting their faith, they had died proclaiming it. And if they could face death with such courage, she would not dishonor them by abandoning Christ now. She was alone, yes, but she was not forsaken. The God they had died for was still with her, and whatever came next, she would meet it as they had, with faith, with courage, and with joy that no suffering could steal. Governor Apronianus had expected the girl to crumble. Orphaned, traumatized, and isolated. Surely she would see reason now. But when his spies reported that Bibiana still attended Christian gatherings in secret, still prayed openly in her empty house, still refused to sacrifice despite having nothing left to lose, he decided on a different strategy. Force had failed with her family. Perhaps seduction would succeed where violence had not. He summoned a woman named Rufina, known throughout Rome for her beauty and her lack of scruples. She had been useful before in corrupting Christian virgins, turning their purity into shame, their witness into scandal. Apronianus gave her instructions. Befriend the girl, win her trust, and introduce her to pleasures she had never known. Offer her a way out, marriage to a wealthy pagan, comfort, security, a future. All she had to do was renounce this dead carpenter from Galilee and embrace the life Rome could offer. Rufina arrived at Bibiana's door with gifts and sympathy. "You poor child," she cooed, her voice smooth as honey. "You've suffered so much. Your family was foolish, but you don't have to follow their path. You're young, beautiful. You could have everything: wealth, position, love. Why throw your life away for a religion that only brings death?" She painted pictures of banquets and silk, of gardens and music, of a handsome suitor who would treat her like a queen. For days, Rufina returned, each time more insistent. She brought fine clothes, rich foods, wine. She spoke of the emptiness of Bibiana's house, the loneliness of her nights. "Your family is dead," she said bluntly. "They can't see what you choose now. Why suffer for people who are gone? Live for yourself. Choose life." But Bibiana saw through the painted mask. She recognized the ancient serpent's voice, the same one that had whispered in Eden. Did God really say? She looked at Rufina with pity rather than anger. "You offer me the world," she said quietly, "but you cannot offer me Christ. My family chose him and died in peace. I will do the same. Your gifts are beautiful, but they rot. Your pleasures are sweet, but they poison. I have nothing, yes, nothing, but everything that matters." Rufina left in frustration, reporting her failure to the governor. Apronianus's face darkened. The girl was more stubborn than her parents. Very well. If kindness would not work, cruelty would. He had been patient enough. They came for her in the middle of the night, dragging her from her bed to the same square where her mother and sister had died. This time, there would be no trial, no speeches, no chances to recant. Apronianus had decided, if she would not bend, she would break. He ordered a punishment designed to destroy her slowly, scourging with whips loaded with lead, designed to tear flesh without immediately killing. The soldiers bound her hands to a post. The crowd that gathered was smaller this time, darker, drawn by the promise of spectacle. The first blow fell, and Bibiana gasped, her body convulsing with pain. The lead weights bit deep, opening wounds that bled freely. Again, the whip cracked. Again, her flesh tore. The soldiers worked methodically, professionally, their faces blank as they carried out their orders. But something extraordinary began to happen. As the beating continued, as her blood soaked into the dust, witnesses would later swear they heard her singing. Not screaming, singing. Fragments of psalms, broken by pain but clear in spirit. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" Her voice was weak, her body failing, but her joy was undeniable. The soldiers paused, unnerved. One whispered to another, "She's not human." For 3 days, they beat her, bringing her to the edge of death but not over it, giving her time to reconsider, to beg, to recant. But each time she regained consciousness, the same serene expression returned to her face. She prayed for her torturers. She thanked God for allowing her to share in Christ's sufferings. She spoke of her family waiting for her in heaven, and through the haze of pain, she smiled. On the 4th day, her body finally gave out. The wounds were too many, the blood loss too great. She died not on the cross like her Lord, but tied to a post, her back shredded, her strength spent. But her spirit had never been more alive. In her last moments, she whispered one final prayer. "Into your hands, Lord, I commend my spirit." The governor ordered her body left in the square as a warning. But a Christian priest named John, risking his own life, came in the night and carried her away. He washed her wounds with tears, wrapped her in clean linen, and buried her in a quiet place outside the city walls. Her suffering was over. Her witness had just begun. Within decades, Christians began visiting Bibiana's tomb. In that quiet spot outside Rome's walls, prayers were offered and miracles reported. The young martyr who had watched her family die, who had resisted temptation and torture alike, who had found joy in the midst of suffering, she became a beacon of hope for those facing their own trials. Pilgrims came, left offerings, and asked her intercession. Her witness spoke louder than any sermon. In the 5th century, as persecution finally ended and Christianity emerged from the shadows, Pope Simplicius built a small church over her tomb. It was modest, but beautiful, a quiet sanctuary that honored the girl who had died rather than deny Christ. Centuries passed, emperors rose and fell. Rome itself transformed from a pagan capital to the heart of Christendom, and through it all, Saint Bibiana's basilica remained, a testament carved in stone to a witness written in blood. In 1626, Pope Urban VIII ordered the church rebuilt and expanded. The great sculptor Bernini was commissioned to create a statue of the saint. He portrayed her not in the moment of her torture, but standing tall, holding the column she was tied to like a victor's staff. Her face is serene, almost joyful. It's a remarkable artistic choice, showing the martyr not as a victim, but as a conqueror, not broken, but triumphant. Bernini understood what many had forgotten. Bibiana's story wasn't about suffering for its own sake, but about joy that transcends suffering. Today, the Basilica of Santa Bibiana still stands near Rome's Termini station, surrounded by the noise and rush of modern life. Tourists pass it daily without noticing. Even many Roman Catholics don't know her story. She has become one of those forgotten saints, remembered mainly for a strange patronage against epilepsy and hangovers, ironically linked to her name's similarity to the Latin bibere, to drink. It's a curious legacy for a virgin martyr, and one that has nothing to do with her actual witness. But perhaps her obscurity is fitting. Bibiana never sought fame. She didn't perform public miracles or found religious orders. She simply remained faithful when faithfulness cost everything. She chose Christ when choosing Him meant losing her family, her security, her very life. And in that choice, hidden and humble as it was, she revealed something essential about Christian joy. It doesn't depend on circumstances, comfort, or even survival. It depends on Christ alone. And that kind of joy, once found, cannot be taken away. Not by seduction, not by scourging, not even by death. Saint Bibiana died around the year 363, beaten to death at barely 20 years old during Julian the Apostate's brief but brutal persecution. She watched her father branded and exiled to die. She witnessed her mother and sister tortured and killed before her eyes. She faced seduction from a courtesan sent to corrupt her. She endured days of scourging with lead-weighted whips. And through it all, witnesses said she maintained a joy that confounded her executioners. Her feast day is December 2nd. Her basilica stands in Rome, restored by Bernini, housing her relics beneath its altar. But her story has largely faded from Christian memory, overshadowed by more famous martyrs, reduced to a footnote in the great narrative of persecution. Most who know her name associate it only with that strange patronage against hangovers, missing entirely the profound witness of joyful suffering she offered. Yet, her story speaks powerfully to modern believers facing trials. For families torn apart by violence or persecution, Bibiana shows that faith can survive even when everyone you love is killed for Christ. For young people pressured to compromise their purity, she demonstrates that resistance is possible even when you're alone and vulnerable. For anyone suffering while watching loved ones suffer, she proves that sorrow and joy can coexist when both are rooted in Christ. And for all who think happiness requires comfort, she reveals that Christian joy transcends circumstances entirely. Bibiana's name means full of life, Viviana in Latin, the living one. How fitting for someone who died so young yet lived so fully, who lost everything earthly yet gained everything eternal, who was killed in body but could never be killed in spirit. She was full of life, even as life drained from her wounds. Full of life, even in death. Full of life because she was full of Christ, and in Him there is life that suffering cannot diminish and death cannot destroy. The basilica stands. The witness endures. And somewhere in the streets of Rome, if you listen closely, past the traffic and the tourists and the noise, you might still hear an echo of that ancient song, a young woman's voice, broken by pain but unbroken in spirit, singing psalms through her scourging, praising God through her tears, finding joy in the midst of suffering because she had found Christ in the midst of everything. Saint Bibiana, the forgotten martyr whose name means full of life. The young woman who smiled through the whips. The Roman virgin who proved that Christian joy isn't happiness dependent on circumstances, but peace rooted in Christ alone. Her family died. Her body broke. But her witness lives on, calling us still to that same costly, joyful faithfulness, full of life, even unto death.